So this is a talk I was supposed to give 3 weeks ago, but it's actually a fitting talk for Advent because I want to focus on St. Joseph. I've made reference to him in our meditations thus far, but we haven't devoted a significant portion to this, what is called the second greatest saint. St Ignatian Loyola in his Spiritual Exercises in the second week, which we're still in if you've lost count, he would have the exercitant repeat 3 times meditations on the Annunciation, on the Nativity, as well as meditate at least once on the presentation in the temple, the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, the obedience of Jesus to Mary and Joseph throughout his childhood, and then the finding in the temple. So it's a lot of meditations, a lot of prayer periods that would involve St. Joseph. And Ignatius tells us to form in our imagination, quote, the history of the mystery. The history of the mystery. And so we can't form the history without St. Joseph. So let's go back to Mary and Joseph's betrothal, starting there. Joseph, as we know, is a righteous man. He's good and he's holy. Now, the church hasn't officially said that Joseph had never been previously married, but myself and some other spiritual writers really believe that Joseph was unmarried before Mary. That Joseph indeed was a virgin. Mary, Fulton Sheen says, is the great virginizer, that she makes a man holy, gives a man the spirit of virginity. And she did the same with Joseph. And this is also why Joseph, despite what depictions of art might show, was probably also a young man. You know, Joseph is often depicted as an old man with a beard. He probably had to be on the donkey going to Bethlehem, not Mary. But that wasn't the case. I mean, and when you form the history of the mystery in your imagination, you can see why Joseph probably had to be young, just historically speaking. But also that sense that Joseph, as a young man, also had to make the sacrifice of being wedded in a physical sense to the Blessed Mother, and that he willingly chose to sacrifice to be a virgin. It wouldn't have been as difficult if he were an elderly man. So here's Mary, the Immaculate Conception herself, the epitome of holiness, the purely open vessel to our Lord. Mary falls in love with Joseph. She falls in love with Joseph. He's not just some caretaker, right? She's his man. She marries him. And Mary, beauty itself, would not have fallen for a man anything less than totally good and totally pure. If you're a parent and you have a daughter that's nearing marriage or one day will near marriage, think of the ideal man you want for your daughter, the ideal spouse. Think of the son-in-law you want, the man who's not just handsome but is kind and intelligent. He's a good provider, he's responsible, possesses a gentle authority, he's vulnerable in a good way, he's decisive, strong, faithful. Joseph had all of those qualities and more. He had it to the extreme. We can only imagine such a man for our children. The people we know or we ourselves might possess some of those attributes, but we fall short of the total picture. Joseph had all the colors of the spectrum, if you will. Why? Because only Mary could be wedded to such a pure and complete man, such a holy man. In the marriage of Mary and Joseph, their souls were united. The fusion of their souls took place. And again, Mary's pure soul couldn't be united to something unalloyed. Pope St. Leo XIII, he wrote about this, of the marriage of Mary and Joseph. He said, quote, "Conjugal union is the greatest of all. By its very nature, it is accompanied by a reciprocal communication of the goods of the spouses. If then God gave St. Joseph to Mary to be her spouse, he certainly did not give him merely as a companion in life, a witness of her virginity, a guardian of her honor, but he made Joseph also participate by the conjugal bond in the eminent dignity which was hers. End quote. So Joseph isn't just some eye candy for nativity sets. He was deeply bonded in a conjugal bond with the Blessed Mother. Mary's holiness is natural in a way. Think of an athlete or a musician who's a phenomenon, a prodigy, where they almost don't need to work for their talent. It just comes naturally. A Mozart, a Michael Jordan. The skill just flows out of them. Now, of course, Mozart and Michael Jordan and others, they worked and they trained, and that's what made them otherworldly, but they had this innate skill, something that was unteachable. You know, sometimes in sports, coaches will say you can't teach that. You can't teach speed, or you can't coach 6'8". Mary's holiness was something God-given in the truest sense. It was uncoachable. Joseph, on the other hand, he has this holiness to the extreme, but it's not as innate, if you will, just to make a comparison. He had to work for his holiness. It's not easily flowing out of him. Think of all the people that have the high skill, but they've had to really, really work hard. Now, I'm not saying this that Mary was lazy or something like that, but just to show the difference in the extremity of the holiness of Mary and Joseph. Joachim and Anne must have been very pleased with their daughter's selection, or Joseph's asking for their daughter's hand in marriage. The parents of Mary must have been pleased, because Joseph was not only a responsible carpenter, he was not only a man who would be able to provide for his family, he was a man who came from the line of David. He was a man that had God in him. We know this. Joseph's father was Jacob. We hear this in Matthew's genealogy, Matthew 1:16. Jacob is Joseph's father. Well, we know Jacob is a significant name in the Old Testament. God himself says, "I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Not the God of the dead, but of the living. So Jacob in the Old Testament, Jacob the great patriarch. His son, the son of Jacob in the Old Testament, is, you guessed it, it's Joseph. Joseph, we talked about him a few weeks ago. Joseph, the youngest of his brothers, the one that's envied, the one who's sold into slavery, goes down to Egypt, the great dreamer, the great planner, who saves Pharaoh, saves not just the people of Egypt, but the entire world during a great famine. Yes, that Joseph. Joseph, the son of Jacob, was a type of Christ, as they say. Remember, the youngest of the brothers was, quote, despised and rejected by man, a man of sorrows, acquainted with infirmity. That's from Isaiah 53:3. Christ was the suffering servant. Christ was the suffering servant because he learned how to be that way from his father Joseph. And his father Joseph learned it from his patron Joseph of the Old Testament, his namesake. The father of Jacob in the Old Testament is Isaac. So if you can keep the family tree, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Isaac, of course, also was a precursor, a type of Christ. Isaac's father is Abraham. Isaac's the one who was almost offered up and sacrificed by Abraham on Mount Moriah. Remember that journey up to Mount Moriah, which would be the seat of the temple in Jerusalem one day. That journey that father and son make is a silent one. Isaac doesn't say much to his father. The only thing he asks is where the animal for the sacrifice was. But otherwise, Isaac is silent, and as he's tied to the funeral pyre, and he allows himself to be bound with wood placed around him. St. Joseph had a similar silent offering in his life as his ancestor did. Quote, "Thereupon Abraham took the wood for the Holocaust and laid it on his son Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife." End quote. That's Genesis 22:6. Isaac carried the wood that was going to be used to burn him. Joseph, a woodworker, a carpenter likewise throughout his life, would take that same wood on his back silently. He would labor not for himself, but for God, for his wife and his child. Just as Abraham was offering his son to God, using the wood as a memorial of his total dedication and trust, so too Joseph, the father of Jesus, totally labored for and trusted in God. Joseph is obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Philippians 2:8, just like Jesus was. And we can make the argument Jesus could only do that because he learned from his father. Joseph, the sacrament of God the Father, the human embodiment of fatherhood. Joseph was silently trusting as he received the various dreams from the angel, trusting in God as he journeyed to Bethlehem, and then to Egypt, and then back to Jerusalem, and then to Nazareth. Hundreds and hundreds of miles Joseph journeyed with his pregnant wife and then his wife and his infant son, trusting as he worked, as he lived, as he died before his own son's hour had come. Yes, how painful must that have been for Joseph to die before he could see his son enter into full glory, but he trusted. Yes, Joachim and Anne, Mary's parents, would have been very pleased with this young man, Joseph. Their expectations were fulfilled then by what Joseph would go on to do for his young wife and child. In the Annunciation, we know that obviously Mary is a woman of prayer, and so too is Joseph. Joseph is a man of prayer. That's why he's attracted to the Blessed Mother. Mary was a prayerful virgin seeking to dedicate her whole life to God. And Joseph was attracted. He was drawn to that. Joseph, therefore, he's familiar with God. When God speaks to Joseph through an angel in a dream, Joseph is able to receive that encrypted message and act on it and act correctly on it. He's not taken aback by the dream. He's not confused. Someone who is not prayerful, someone who didn't know God, someone who did not have frequent communion with God would not have been able to act on that dream the way Joseph was able to. Yes, Joseph is a devout man. Joseph exercised discernment, to use one of Ignatius's terms. He exercised discernment after his dream, judging whether this message was from the Lord or not, because it very well could have been from the evil one. In the discernment of spirits, the rules for the discernment of spirits that St Ignatius of Loyola provides, he says the devil sometimes will, quote, disguise himself as an angel of light. The devil would disguise himself as an angel of light. This is the fourth rule of the second week. This is what Ignatius says. It is a mark of the evil spirit to assume the appearance of an angel of light. He begins by suggesting thoughts that are suited to a devout soul and ends by suggesting his own. For example, the evil spirit will suggest holy and pious thoughts that are wholly in conformity with the sanctity of the soul. Afterwards, he will endeavor little by little to end by drawing the soul into his hidden snares and evil designs. End quote. It's a very profound meditation or a rule, if you will. The devil doesn't try to bring us down to hell necessarily by telling us to go murder someone. That's too easy. We can reject that. But he might give us a holy thought that we think is good, but if we indulge that holy thought, it could lead us actually back into ourselves and into greater sin. So just because the angel told Joseph to do something which seemed good on the surface, didn't necessarily mean it was good. Joseph had to pray through this. He had to discern. So, for instance, the angel could have suggested to Joseph to divorce Mary and to stone her. That would have been in keeping with the Mosaic Code. That would have been a devout and holy thing on the surface to do. But obviously we know that could not have been from God. We wouldn't want the Blessed Mother to get stoned. So Joseph is able to discern that when the angel is telling Joseph to not divorce his wife, to take his pregnant wife into his home, that this indeed is from God. The Litany of Joseph, one of the titles it gives, is Joseph Most Prudent. Joseph Most Prudent, because he is a man of discernment. Another title that the Litany gives to Joseph is Joseph, the Terror of Demons. The terror of demons. Yes, Satan and his minions have no power over Joseph because, for one reason, he can so easily detect the evil spirit and reject it. Joseph is a true man of discernment, and so he's the terror of demons. In a modern painting of St. Joseph, Joseph is holding the baby Jesus in his arm, and he's standing on the dragon, which is obviously the devil. And Jesus, in Joseph's arm, is holding a long pole, and at the top, Jesus is holding the top of the pole, which is a lily branch. But the lily branch, as it goes lower to the ground, transforms into a spear. And so the spear is the blade of the spear is killing the dragon. So Joseph in art, he's often depicted with a lily as a symbol of purity and righteousness. He's pure because he holds on to God. He holds on to Jesus. And it is that purity in focusing on Jesus and what is of God that kills the evil one, dispels the evil spirits, and makes Joseph a prudent saint to do the will of God. Yes, indeed, Joseph exercised something that Ignatius would come up with centuries later, the rules for the discernment of spirit. And Joseph stayed married to Mary, not begrudgingly or not bitterly. We can imagine that Joseph loved Mary as if it was a normal marriage, as if everything was human about it without the Annunciation. He loved Mary after the Annunciation more than he did before. He loved her as much as he did had this miraculous birth not occurred. Joseph, picture this, was delighted to be married to the most blessed of all women and to be a father. Sometimes we think Joseph might have been disappointed or saddened by this, but he wasn't. So in my own prayer with these various scenes, especially the scene of the visitation, Joseph, this young man, escorts Mary in the scene of the visitation when Mary travels the hill country of Judea to see her cousin Elizabeth. Joseph escorted Mary. We don't know exactly if this happened. I'm not saying my imagination is historical. And I'm not making the argument, indeed, that Joseph did do this, but I believe it's probable that Joseph would have escorted Mary. A young maiden, pregnant, wouldn't have just gone off by herself throughout the countryside. So Joseph goes with Mary to Judea. He leaves Mary then with her cousin Elizabeth for 3 months. And then Joseph returns to Nazareth. And he goes back to Nazareth, and he doesn't just open up a case of Coors Light and relax. No, he goes to work. He makes his home, or his house that was once a bachelor pad, now a house that's ready to have a family. I know it sounds lame, but he was probably child-proofing some of the furniture. Maybe he crafted a crib, made toys that his son would soon use, a rattle. He cleaned up the house. Maybe he added an extension onto the home. Picture Joseph doing these things lovingly while he's by himself for those 3 months during the visitation. That's the heart of Joseph. That's his love language, providing for his family. Joseph never lost sight of his wife and child during this time alone. Yes, it was painful for him to be separated from Mary for these 3 months, but he was happy to be able to work for her, to use his skills with wood to help the family. He was turning, like I said, his bachelor pad into a home for the Holy Family. Not that Joseph necessarily had like a leopard skin carpet or a neon Miller Lite sign or a pool table in his house, but that he was able to be mindful, to be considerate, and not be selfish. And Joseph would have continued this work to provide for Mary as they lived together during their betrothal until the time came for them to be enrolled in the census mandated by Caesar Augustus. Joseph and Mary would have spent this time conversing, praying together, working gently around their home as Mary neared the end of her pregnancy. Again, picture this in your prayer if you can. See Joseph as a man of goodness, genuineness, simplicity, and holiness. Like I said a few weeks ago, Ignatius tells us to enter the scene or these scenes as the slave boy or slave girl that's helping the Holy Family. We're there to assist at the birth of Jesus. We're there to assist at the flight into Egypt. We cannot help if Joseph doesn't want us. The father, he determines who's going to get close to his wife and to his child. But we are wanted. We are able to help, to be that slave boy and slave girl. Why? Only because Joseph desires us to be there. Joseph wants us to be near his precious wife. He wants us to hold Mary. He wants us to hold Jesus, his baby. He trusts us to do that because he sees beneath our sins to the depths of our hearts. He sees our purity, our goodness, our righteousness. The birth of Jesus didn't last one day. Like we celebrate Christmas on December 25th and then it ends on December 26th. It didn't last 2 or 3 days the way a woman might stay in the hospital for a couple days after she gives birth and then is released. The Holy Family was in Bethlehem for several weeks. They probably went up to Jerusalem for the circumcision and the presentation, back to Bethlehem before they went down to Egypt, hundreds of miles into Egypt, beyond the border, so they could be safe. Joseph would have had to seek work. He would have done some carpentry work in that home in Bethlehem, and then in Egypt he would have procured food, other provisions. One day Joseph would have visited the census polling station to get that job done. Imagine him dealing gently and authoritatively with the rude census polling official. Imagine how patient he was living with his relatives in Bethlehem in a foreign home. About trying to find work, how patient he was. How trusting in God he was, being out of a job, so to speak. He was confident without being arrogant. He was trusting without being lazy or complacent. He's the perfect man. If we want to grow towards some of that perfection, we would do worse than to pray with St. Joseph, the father of Jesus and our own Father. St. Joseph, pray for us.